thinking, I'm ruined it.
Right. Well, yeah. Thinking is perhaps reserved for critical judgment rather than creative production.
Yeah.
You have to open yourself up to a kind of attention. And it's interesting that, you say you collected a very large number of items to work with. It's initial overproduction followed by selection. And that's another thing useful for people who are listening to this or watching it might want to know. Like, when I write way more than I keep. And then I can select. And so I don't constrain myself to begin with. I can write down whatever I want, knowing full well that I'm going to modify it or throw much of it away. So I had images in mind, photographs, paintings that captured the theme of what I wanted to portray in the illustration for the chapter. And so as we progressed through the 12, I had sent an image or two or three, perhaps, I don't exactly remember, that sort of hinted at what I was looking for. And so then you worked off that initial suggestion, but you produced something that was in that vein, but not by any means the same thing. So let's show everybody the illustrations one by one and talk about each of them. So we saw number 1. The Fool.
Yeah, I had much more, obviously. I had much more. I had mountains, I had extra stuff, and I always minimize it. Not necessary, out. I simplified it completely.
In rule number 1, don't denigrate social institutions or creative accomplishment. Reading that title, I didn't realize what you meant until I read the chapter. And what that is ultimately, and correct me if I misstate anything, but cultural institutions are the order. They're the stability. And
they're what you're granted. They're these identities that are handed to you ready-made. And thank God for that. Marriage is one. It's like, well, you can critique marriage, fine, but what game are you going to play? Try coming up with one on your own. Maybe you can. Maybe you're like avant-garde Picasso. Maybe you are. And maybe you have a right to make your own arrangement. Maybe you have the psychological fortitude to craft your own social institution. But I bloody well wouldn't count on it. You're lucky that there's such a thing as a job, or better yet, a career. You're lucky that there's such a thing as friendship, as marriage. All of these social institutions, and when you criticize them, Nietzsche put as one question of conscience, and I think it's in Twilight of the Idols, whether you're a leader or whether you're running away, you're outside the pack and moving in a different direction in either case. Are you a rebel because you can't fit in? Or are you a rebel because you could fit in, but you see a better way? It's like, people in that category are not that common. And the first question of conscience should be, well, which of those two are you? It's highly probable that you're the first one and not the second, because that would mean you'd be intensely disciplined plus creative on that dimension. Maybe that is you, and God, then we need you, like you're an avatar of the Savior under those circumstances. And maybe everyone has some of that in them.
The first rule that you talk about, Jordan, is not to carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. And here, this is really a post-partisan message. It's a recognition that conservatives' respect for tradition, respect for the past, is really a respect for institutions that have been built up over the course of thousands of years in conjunction with an increasingly good understanding of human nature. And that has to be balanced with a recognition that we can't get so tied up in these rules that it becomes impossible to extricate ourselves from them. We can't fossilize these rules and turn them into something that is unchangeable in any way. That in essence, we should be cautious about changing the rules of society. They should be changeable, so we shouldn't obliterate them. But we also you have to know the rules of the game before you can change the rules of the game. If you're playing Calvin ball in Calvin and Hobbes, and the rules of the game change every second, that's not a game anymore. That's just an exercise of power. But you also have to recognize that sometimes the rules do have to change. How do you balance those two things?
Well, I think the first thing you do is vow to tell the truth. so that you don't foul yourself up. And then I think you pay attention to what manifests itself to you as meaningful. Because I think that meaning, I literally think, and I think this empirically as well as spiritually, let's say, I believe that the instinct of meaning signifies the optimal information processing function of the nervous system. So when you're balanced properly between order and novelty, or order and chaos, that manifests itself to you as deep engagement. And that's a signal. And it's not merely cognitive, it's way deeper than that. It's a signal that you're in the right place, doing the right thing at the right time. And everyone wants that. And everyone wants that all the time. Like, images of paradise are representations of that state of being. So it's there for you, but there are preconditions. And one of the preconditions is that you strive to do the best, to aim at the best. And that has to be your fundamental ethos. And it's a decision that, despite all of the calamities of being, that your primary ethical obligation is to work for the betterment of yourself and others. And that's a very complex decision, because there's so much of you that's twisted and turned against existence itself because of its suffering and complexity. It's very hard to get your head straight about that. And so you get warped and twisted by resentment and deceit and temptations of various sorts. So that has to be straightened out so that you are aiming in the right direction. And once you manage that, or perhaps in conjunction with that, you have to watch what you say. You have to say what you believe to be true, not because you're trying to accomplish something specific with what you're saying, but because you're attempting to represent what's happening in front of you as accurately as you possibly can, and let go of the consequences. And then you search for the engagement that produces. And this is one of the things I love about long form podcasts, is that when a conversation takes off properly and it's dynamic and unscripted, both of the participants are striving to keep that sense of engagement constantly at play. And if they do that, then the conversation is engaging and deep, and gets as deep as the people involved can manage, and they'll pull the entire audience along for the ride.